I now want to go over a few important things that you should always keep in mind when designing a PCB in Fritzing. One of them is you always want to make sure that your components are within the PCB board itself. So you don't want this where our wire isn't on the PCB. You always want to make sure that your PCB is able to encapsulate everything that you want it to. Another important thing is to keep in mind your sizing. Now, in Fritzing, if you go to the search bar and type in ruler, you can click and drag a ruler onto your view. You can also change the size of this ruler, so if I want to keep it in inches and I want a 12-inch ruler, I can do that, and now I have a 12-inch ruler. It's important to keep in mind scale, especially the size of the material that you're going to use to create your PCB board. If the material size is 6 inches, you don't want to design a PCB board meant for something that's 8 inches. So it's important to keep that in mind, and it's also important when you're figuring out where you want your components to be in relation to each other. So if you don't want your button right next to your LED, if you take the ruler, you can make sure that it's in the correct position. You can rotate your ruler like this. So if I say it's on 4 inches, if I want my button to be 1 inch away, I can now move my button, and now my button is an inch away from my LED. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other important thing is, like I mentioned in the other video, always make sure you're on the bottom layer when you are creating your wires. This is especially important for the Carvey. We don't do two-sided PCBs on the Carvey. We do one-sided. So that is important to keep in mind. Another important thing to keep in mind is how close your wires are to each other. So if I create a break in this wire, you can see the wires are now crossing, which is not a good thing. You can get pretty close, like this, and Fritzing will usually increment things for you, but you also want to make sure that your wiring isn't too close to the edge of the PCB board, because then when you actually cut out the PCB board, it might cut into that wiring, and we don't want that. And one other thing you want to keep in mind is the complexity of your PCB. PCB boards are meant to reduce or completely eliminate any sort of wiring that would need to be done. All you usually have to do is solder the pinouts, but you also have to keep in mind time. When you use any of our machines, you cannot walk away from the machine. You always have to be present. So if you make a really complicated PCB board that's going to take an hour, you have to be around for that hour in case anything goes wrong with the machine. You are responsible when using it. So those are just some important notes. Especially keep in mind the scale, make sure your wires aren't crossing, make sure the PCB board doesn't cut anything off, and make sure that you understand and make enough time for when you are actually printing out your PCB.